Hello. Today we're taking another look at a film in part of this ongoing series about depictions of the ancient world in film and television, which sometimes branches out into history, particularly military history from other periods. But today we're very firmly in the Greco-Roman world, and we're looking at Alexander, the Oliver Stone movie from 2004. Now, one of the problems with dealing with this is that there have been several editions. When I was doing some searching, I could see at least three. I've got a vague memory of another one as well. And I remember having these conversations at the time of people saying, oh, this is the one you need to see. This is much better than the others. I remember going to see it in the cinema. So I saw what I think became known as the theatrical version, logically enough. And then bought the same film on DVD a year or two later when that came out, which had documentaries and commentary with not simply Oliver Stone, but also Robin Lan Fox. So that's interesting, having the historian who'd written one of the classic biographies of Alexander the Great, was the advisor on the film, seemed to be involved for several years, took part in a couple of the cavalry charges as an extra, dressed up as a companion cavalryman. So, there's not many historical advisors who've managed to do that sort of thing. So that's quite an interesting take. However, I went back and watched bits of that and some of the documentaries, but I noticed that on Amazon Prime we had Alexander Revisited, the final cut, in brackets unrated. So I watched that through and was quite surprised because it's a very different film, not simply because it's longer, but the way the scenes are ordered and the story is told. So I think I've seen at least two different versions. I may have seen another one as well. I can't quite remember. And it makes a talk like this a little bit difficult. Now, as anyone will know who's seen the other ones I've done, these aren't meant as detailed reviews of every aspect, and they're certainly not meant as nitpicking or, well, this is wrong historically and that sort of thing. It's a little bit more difficult to talk about something when there's several versions knocking around and people may not have seen the one I'm talking about. So I'll try to bear that in mind, but it does mean there's an element of confusion from the start because there are some major differences in sequencing. So, for instance, the theatrical version, according to the back of the DVD, is 168 minutes long, whereas the revisited, the final cut, that's 214 minutes. And playing through them and looking at the counter on the screen itself, that did seem to be pretty close. So you're dealing with about 45 minutes extra material. And it's not simply that, but there's extra bits inserted. I'm a bit of a Tolkien buff, so I enjoyed the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings films more than the originals. I liked some of the extra details that came in. Same with The Hobbit, though obviously The Hobbit is less close to the source material, such as it is. As a digression, the sort of slightly depressing things about those films when it comes to comparing them to historical films is, for all the many liberties taken in them, particularly the Lord of the Rings films are probably closer to the source material, and the level of detail they went into in scene building struck me as often greater than that they do for historical periods, perhaps because you're having to create a fantasy world from scratch anyway. So you're going to have to build everything. You're not going to find sets that will do well enough. In the case where you can use a castle or a manor house, and okay, yes, it's obviously got later features and fancier windows and is a bit more comfortable than, say, the medieval setting of your film, but it'll do. It's an old building, it looks okay. So with Alexander, we've got several different versions, and I think that's an indication of some of the issues with the film. It's one of those films that whenever you go back, I think you like it more. Partly because, like everything else, you go in with high expectations. I think it was with Alexander where I first began my conscious policy of trying not to expect too much and enjoying what they gave, making the most of it, and just being glad that they're doing films about subjects like that interest me and that I care about. But some of it is a little bit odd. So you have to get past the Irish accents. I don't know whether it was because they'd cast Colin Farrell, I believe was involved quite early on, to be Alexander. Anyway, whether it was because of that or simply they made a decision, I can see the logic that, from Oliver Stone's point of view, the Macedonians weren't fully fledged Greeks. in the sense that you have in that source, in the sources, a perception that they're, maybe they're not Greek at all. At the very least, they're on the fringes of the barbarian world. And yes, they speak Greek, but it's in this sort of fairly vulgar dialect that was distinctive. The Macedonian dialect stood out as something different from mainstream Greek, if you can talk about mainstream Greek, because obviously that there are other dialects, other accents as well that vary considerably. But Greeks still seem to have been able to understand each other. Probably could understand the Macedonian dialect, at least mostly, but that may have been a bit more of a struggle. But you have, for instance, the case of another Macedonian king, an earlier Alexander, who wanted to enter the Olympic Games, and we're told there was a debate over whether or not he was eligible. Was he Greek? And he got in by claiming that the royal family were descendants of refugees, exiles from the city of Argos in the Peloponnese, and therefore the royal bloodline was fully Greek, so that's okay. By Philip's day, by Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, he's entering chariots in the Olympic Games and nobody's questioning this at all. But the world had moved on from that, and Macedonia was becoming far more important so rapidly under Philip's rule. So anyway, they took the decision that all the Macedonians would have Irish accents to make them stand out from the other Greeks. There aren't too many other Greeks that actually get to do a lot in the film. You get Aristotle, you get a few men in the army, but on the whole, they're talked about and they're seen in the background in the the assassination bit of Philip II. There's an audience of Greeks, but they don't do. But nevertheless, I think it was this idea to emphasize the Macedonians as a little bit outlandish, a little bit different. They're not quite the Greeks we expect. And again, something I've touched on before. There aren't too many Hollywood movies or TV series that look at the Greek world. You've got this one, you've got the earlier, I think it's in 1956, certainly 1950s, Richard Burton, Alexander the Great film, which we'll probably cover someday or other when I can find my copy, which I'm sure is buried in a box somewhere. That's an epic of its time and has that cast of thousands element, but it doesn't always work through. You've got 300 Spartans, with the participation of the Greek army, which is quite a decent little film, even if it considerably embellishes the Thermopylae story and makes the Spartans rather more modern in many respects. But nevertheless, that's interesting. You've obviously had the based on comic book 300 and whatever the sequel was called, the one about Salamis, that are from the start not presenting themselves as too historically accurate in the first place. Maybe we'll deal with those one day. I'll see. We'll certainly do 300 Spartans. But compared to the number of epics about Rome, now, of course, you could argue that Cleopatra and the other films involving Cleopatra as a character in the TV series, you're going into the Ptolemaic Greek world there, which of course you are, although so often on screen it's presented as far more almost New Kingdom Egyptian, or a stylized version of that, rather than consciously Greek. We do have a visual problem in that for most modern observers, if you're not interested in the ancient world, Greek or Roman, Carthaginian even, they're basically just some bloke in a white sheet, and they all look the same. And it's harder to differentiate between them, say, and a Persian with his trousers and his more colourful gear, or a Gaul or a German or a barbarian, something like that. So you get fewer films about the Greek world, and even such a key figure as Alexander. It's partly this, the Romans have just become fashionable in a way. And same, you get far more films about the Vikings in that era than you do about early Germanic, Anglo-Saxon settlement, or even the Middle Ages proper. It's always surprising, perhaps this is a British perspective, but I think people in northern France and Normandy would think the same, how little, the good story of 1066 and William the Conqueror's success and William the Conqueror's career seems to get ignored. There's very little. I remember a sort of Euro mini-series that was pretty dodgy 10, 20 years or more ago. But there's surprisingly little. Vikings are box office. Gladiators and Romans are box office. Ancient Egyptians, not really. You don't get many films about them. Greeks, again, there's less interest. And it is like that. You can see the same pattern in the way non-fiction history books are written, and particularly fiction and novels. There is a tendency to go for particular periods, and it's easier in a sense if you start off with a world that you feel your audience has a level of familiarity and they know a little bit what to expect. Now, that image in their heads they have of this may not be terribly accurate, but nevertheless it's very strong. So there's a sense of Rome and Caesars and senators and slaves and gladiators and all that sort of thing. There's less of a sense, I don't think too many of the audience, unless they've got an interest in ancient history, and particularly Macedonian Greek history, know that much about the Macedonian kingdom, or even know that much about Alexander the Great. He's still a name, but while there are plenty of people who become fascinated by the story, and there's a book on Alexander pretty much every year, if not more than one, being released, there isn't that same dramatic interest. There aren't plays about him, so many films about him, TV series about him. We've had recently, I was involved in the one, was it Titans of the Ancient World? They did an episode, drama documentary on Alexander, and there's the Netflix series on at the moment, which again I've not seen yet. So there's an attempt to push it and to broaden the documentary interest, because they do Roman stuff, and Hannibal's been done and done and done and done. Though again, with if the movie project about Hannibal with the team that's supposed to be putting that together and finally has got there, does that, then probably there'll be more documentary interest as well, because people think, well, the audience are going to want to know. People will have been reminded about Hannibal's story, so they'll want factual versions as far as a TV documentary can do of what's going on, what should we believe from the film, what have they got right, what have they got wrong, that sort of thing. And just more generally, this is an interesting story, I would like to know more. So if that Denzel Washington project comes through, that'll obviously be one where we'll try and sort of review the trailer first, and then go and see the thing and talk about that, because that's of big interest, and it'll be interesting to see how they do that. So you're starting with an audience that's less familiar when you're dealing with Alexander the Great. Many people won't know too much about him, so it meant there were quite a lot of quite bold decisions with the Oliver Stone film that, as I say again, once you get used to the idea of what it's doing, you can start to see, okay, I think I know why they did that, and yeah, I can sort of see that works in some respects, or sometimes actually, yes, I think that works quite well. It can be a little bit of a shock. I think there was a very muted reception, not too favourable when the film came out, because some people found it confusing, some were just surprised. Again, the Irish accents, it's a little bit odd, but, I can, as I say, I can see the logic. This is the idea of representing the Macedonians as a bit different and showing them as not quite the safe, civilized Greeks that we imagine. Basically, that everybody's an Athenian philosopher. And of course, you see Aristotle, played by Christopher Plummer, pretty briefly in the theatrical version. He again, like a lot of the characters that are in the scenes from Macedonia, they're embellished. There's more of them. There's longer scenes. They get to do a little bit more in the final cut, because again, you've just simply got that much more time. So I can see it, and each time I've seen it, this sort of bothers me less, and I start thinking, okay, yes, I think this actually works. While we're on the subject, we might as well talk a little bit about casting in terms of Colin Farrell as Alexander. I think he's good. You could argue, strictly speaking, he's probably a bit tall. I think he's about 5'10" or something like that, judging from the Oracle of Wikipedia. We don't have a height for Alexander, just these sources talking about that he was fairly small, and that you have, which they do in the film, they transfer it from after the Battle of Issus to Babylon, where Darius's daughter Statira and his mother come along, and they address Hephaestion as the king of the Macedonians because he's taller and better looking than Alexander, and Alexander's fine with this. Again, we'll come back to that and that relationship, and it's nicely done, and there will be quite a lot of that where they take an incident that is in the sources but place it somewhere else, which I think is a reasonable thing to do, and is probably better than straightforward inventing, which so many filmmakers feel they need to do to get the story across and to explain everything that they want to cover, but that it can work and sometimes not. And it's a little bit, go back to the I'm Spartacus scene in the Spartacus movie. It always feels a great shame there's no evidence for that, and this probably didn't happen because it's a great piece of cinema. So you can invent things that work magnificently and become more famous than the reality. but also you can do stuff that sometimes you think, well, actually, that's a bit duller than what we think really happened. So I think Colin Farrell is good. He certainly has that active. He looks convincing doing the fighting and the battle scenes, and he is enigmatic as Alexander. You can't pin him down, and this is a theme of the film, and you can sense listening to the commentaries and the documentaries and this sort of thing, that while I think on the whole Oliver Stone has quite a favourable view of Alexander, which is fair enough, you want to make a film about him, which was clearly a project he'd nurtured for a long time and wanted to do. He rather likes him. He is willing to buy into the idea that Alexander wants to create this sort of great empire with mixing all the races together, or at least putting them all on an equal level. Globalization, he talks about in the commentary, as a sort of early idea of that. We'll come back to that because that's a big issue, and it's to do with scenes in the film. I'm a little less sure, but nevertheless you can see that. But he does show a lot of the ambiguity of Alexander. And of course you have one of the main devices, as far as I can see in all versions of the film, is that this doesn't just tell the story in sort of linear order from the start. Alexander's a kid. Alexander has, parents that are in conflict with Olympias, and Philip falls out of favour, grows up, father murdered, becomes king, heads off to Persia, beats that, goes off to India. Army says it won't go any further, comes back, dies in Babylon. It's quite a complicated story, even though Alexander died so young. He's only in his early 30s. Nevertheless, he does so much in that period that, again, there's one of the commentary pieces where Oliver Stone said, well, I tried doing it as a linear story and found that it took so long just to get him to the early stage into Persia that it was going to be pretty dull for the audience. So instead it's episodic, and it's not chronological. You have scenes from the Persian War, then you'll go back to his childhood, then you'll go back to his youth, his adolescence, then you'll go back to the Persian War, then you'll go to India, dotted around, and it's tied together by a narration by Ptolemy the First, played by Anthony Hopkins, who is there in Alexandria 40 plus years on from the death of Alexander. He's established this kingdom. He's the first of the Ptolemies. His dynasty is going to last until Cleopatra. There are scenes within the library of Alexander where he's trying to make this the centre of Greek and specifically Athenian culture, and Alexandria has its laws based on those of Athens, and it's Alexandria near Egypt, it's not Alexandria in Egypt. And then those are nice scenes. You get the view over the harbour, the Pharos lighthouse. This is one of those films, it was one of the sort of the early days of CGI, or the relatively early days, where it's in use, but it's a bit harder to use at this stage. I think things have got a little bit easier now, though, again, to do it really well tends to require a bigger budget and a diligence, and you can see the difference. They were able to do it well in series like Masters of the Air for many scenes. I mean, sometimes there were things, the way they did it I didn't particularly like, but on the whole it looks convincing, and that takes a lot of skill in the departments doing it, and directors and production need to understand how it's best used. And I think this film on Alexander makes very good use of the CGI. There are never really times when you think, oh yeah, that just doesn't look right. It seems to add to it, but they don't overuse it. So you get these scenes of spectacle and casts of many, many thousands, or tens of thousands, or even more, but it doesn't overwhelm the film, and you never lose the characters, and it never jars, and you think, oh, yeah, that just doesn't look right. But again, it's one of those things to remember. This was the CGI technology of 20 years ago, and now even drama documentaries and things can produce some pretty decent stuff in a way that 5-10 years ago they didn't. It always looked pretty false. Now it's looking much better. So you have Anthony Hopkins there as Ptolemy, telling the story and going and explaining what's going on. So I think all the versions of the film begin with the death of Alexander in 323 BC. And his commanders waiting around like vultures, they're described as to well, who's going to take over? Who's going to get this empire? We've got all this land, all this power, all this money. There's a big army out there, but who's going to control it? And of course, we know the funeral games of Alexander will go on for more than a generation of them fighting each other, and Ptolemy is one of the winners in that. But again, nobody can take the entire empire. It fragments, and you have these different groups, and they're thinking in different ways. While they may all dream of being Alexander and reuniting everything, it isn't possible. Just doesn't happen. And several of the figures, like Antigonus Gonatus, Antigonus the One-Eyed, features through the story. Cassander is another one, often in places where they weren't actually present historically, because they can be there at the end, because essentially they've worked around a cast that is there in most scenes, as long as they survive that long, and giving a sense, and in many cases they're there because of what they did after the film and after Alexander's death makes them important. So it's quite an interesting choice that you've got them there, and I quite like that you won't, from watching the film, you won't necessarily know why these men will be so important, because this is about before that time when they become the leaders and the main contenders in the contest for Alexander's empire. Now, I'm a big fan of Anthony Hopkins, and it's so I think he's very good as the older Ptolemy, but his narration almost at times, and his commentary on some of the things you've just seen, does add a deep level of ambiguity to a lot of what you're seeing, because he's sort of saying, oh no, that wasn't really, of course it wasn't like that, and you're not quite sure, left not quite sure what to believe. Now, I think that's a very interesting approach, and it's a very fair one for Alexander, because as, again, they note in the documentaries and the commentaries and things, what we tend to forget is that the sources for Alexander are terribly late. Most of them are 400 years plus after his death. The big ones, Plutarch and Arrian, are even later than that. These are around about the year 100 AD, a little bit later, and the account written by Ptolemy only survives where other people quote it, or at least refer to it. And there was a naive tendency in the past to assume that Arrian is basically just parroting Ptolemy, so what we see in Arrian we can take as this was in the original. I don't think anybody really believes that now, but it's clearly not the case. These are active people, and I do wonder with some of the presentation of Alexander as a general in Arrian, and Arrian is perhaps the most military inclined of all our sources. He's actually filtering that through his expectation of what a Roman commander should do, what a great Roman commander should do, and assuming that, well, Alexander's going to do that sort of best practice, which might well be right in many respects. Arrian is someone who has commanded a province, commanded a Roman army on campaign himself, so he does, he has some idea about this, but also you wonder, have you just filtered this through? This is the Roman perception of what Alexander should have been, as we would understand it, to make him a great commander. And while there were vast amounts of material produced about Alexander and much propaganda, he had official historians with him, he encouraged it. Later leaders like Augustus would note that Alexander made himself a little bit ridiculous because he allowed the sources around him to exaggerate so much, to add fanciful elements or just exaggerate it. It's the urge of any leader to obviously tell the story in a way favourable to themselves, as someone like Julius Caesar does in his commentaries, but there you can push it too far, and the feeling was that Alexander did, when, let's face it, his achievements are so spectacular anyway that he didn't really need to do that. He could have just let them talk for himself, but it wasn't the nature of the times, and it's not the nature of... But remember, he is very, very young. This is a man who's invading the biggest empire in the world in his early 20s, and not long been king, not terribly secure, surrounded by much older people, who's got to prove himself and got to keep on, telling everybody this is all the great stuff I'm doing. So, and there is so much, because this material is later, you don't know how much to believe. You end up with different traditions about Alexander that are then all distorted in the Wars of the Successors, in the funeral games, because people like Ptolemy are not writing to get it 100% right. They are writing in a way that will hopefully strengthen their own position. At the very least, the fact that you become one of the great historians of Alexander the Great, you're trying to sort of take part of that legacy, that reputation, and add it to your own and your family's. The story is presented as if Ptolemy is writing a sort of more personal account of it all than the published histories that we know existed, but as I say, don't survive. and then at the end of the film, he'll basically decide, no, destroy it all. We can't let people know this. So very consciously and understandably, quite reasonably, this is presented as a sort of a fictionalized view of Alexander's life. It's not meant to be a documentary. It's not meant to be 100% accurate, but it does try and... The aim is, I think, to give the essence of Alexander, his times, his achievements, the people around him, his family. Because of the nature of the sources, there's so much where a lot of this is going to be you're opting for one particular interpretation. Or you're deciding, well, we don't know, so this is how I'm going to present it. And they try and do it more subtly. I think all credit to them, the ambition is there. And you feel a film about Alexander needs to have excessive ambition. You're probably never going to fulfill all the things you dream of in the same way that Alexander, his army will turn back. But they try very hard. They try and do an awful lot within the space of the film. And that does mean, with this format as well, that I think it can be quite a confusing watch, particularly if you have no idea of the background. So if you don't really know about Philip and Olympias, let alone Ptolemy, the city of Alexandria in Egypt, let alone Cassada, Parmenio, or Parmenion, they tend to use, apart from Alexander, they use the Greek form of most of the names, so it's Hephaestion and Parmenion rather than the anglicised versions. Philotas, people like that. Things like the Pages conspiracy is a very quick scene. So there's a lot that has to come in, and there's quite a lot that's alluded to that you wouldn't pick up on if you didn't know the wider story. And again, I like that, but that's because if you can spot what's there if you know what you're looking for. So even there's little details like the tutor of the Alexander, who's training all the boys together as pages. You've got the name of the real man, Olympias's relative, who is a pretty harsh trainer. I think it's Brian Blessed. So he's, again, a big presence for the brief scene he's in. So there's lots of detail that's there. But it does mean there's a lot to take in. And I suspect it was always going to be hard for a lot of the audience. It isn't an easy film. It's one that requires you to think, to concentrate, to pick up on who everybody is and follow it through. And if you don't have some background in the story in general, I think it's probably particularly confusing. If you do have a background in the story, then you might be distracted by the fact that, hang on a minute, that's happening there when that should be later on, or chronology's a bit out. It does the sort of thing that now seems de rigueur with Netflix and the like, where because it's jumping around in time, you get 7 years earlier, 40 years later, 20 years earlier, all this sort of thing. In a few cases, I wasn't quite sure the numbers added up in the final version, but I suspect that's because they've taken a few liberties story-wise in placing incidents not when they actually happen, but a little bit later or a little bit earlier, to fit with the plot and to try and make it more coherent, which again, yes, the strict historian in me says, oh, no, you shouldn't do that sort of thing, but the storyteller, well, yeah, okay, that's entirely reasonable, and it's good that you are trying to put those incidents in, and you're trying to explain them and give some sense of their importance, how they mattered, that fits with your version of the story. Because in the end, it is too big a story. You can't tell a detailed account of all that Alexander did in 2.5, even 3.5 hours. He does so much in that time. So major elements are not there in the story at all, or briefly alluded to. You see these maps with where they've going. So you don't see Alexander go to Egypt. You don't see him go to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa, traveling through the desert to get there, claiming to interpret what the oracle says is that he's the son of Zeus. You don't get one of the ones that I think is a great shame is you don't get the burning of Persepolis. Most of the Persian Empire stuff is focused on Babylon, and you have these very grand sets, and there's some nice stuff where you have the sense of this, this group of Hicks from Macedonia are riding into this city where the crowds are welcoming them as the Babylonians did, because again, they didn't have any particular loyalty to the king. They just want stability, and they want somebody who's going to treat them well, reasonably enough, and allow them to continue their traditional laws, religion, customs that are much older than any of the empires that have been ruling them in, for generations. So there is a sense of these sort of wide-eyed Macedonians looking around at all this magnificence and thinking, well, have we beaten these people? They can build all of this, and yet we've just smashed their armies. So what's and the sense of this is more money, more wealth, more luxury, more silk, more devices than anyone could ever enjoy, spend, or do. So that's impressive. There are scenes like that, but you don't get Persepolis and then the drunken party where it's burned down, involving an Athenian courtesan and all this sort of thing, which is a great story, as is the Ammon Siwa stuff. But again, there are so many great stories with Alexander that they can't possibly all fit in. So while personally you might think, oh, I wish they'd done that one, and maybe they could have sacrificed some of the ones they do, you can't really blame them. It's like any of these series or films that take on a really big topic. They simply will not be able to put everything in there, and they're trying to give you snapshots and an overall feel. And that's true with series like Masters of the Air, and that's something again, huge topic, so a lot's going to fall out assuming this Hannibal film happens. Again, you can't do all of Hannibal's story in a couple of hours, in 3 hours or so. There is so much that happens, and there will always be that lure. The great sort of epic is the Hannibal getting to Italy bit, and it tends to draw you in, and it's very hard to resist telling a lot of that story because there's great stuff in it, but it's only the start of the war. And I don't know how they'll do that, because while Denzel Washington is a very charismatic actor, he's quite old for Hannibal, unless you're doing a Hannibal looking back on his life. But again, you might say, well, okay, let's, rather than Colin Farrell basically has to play Alexander from about 16 through to 33. And that's not such a big range, though at times you think he sort of looks a little bit too old for the moment, but not too. And again, how could you do it any other way? Same is going to be true when you do with any historical figure. I mean, the Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon is a bit more extreme, where he never looks like the sort of 20-year-old ambitious artillery officer. He's older than Napoleon. What the actor is older than Napoleon was at Waterloo. But again, how can you avoid that? You want to have, unless you have some pretty incredible makeup, but the odds are that the changes that occur in somebody's face from their sort of late teens through to their about 30 odd are very hard to replicate in any way. And it'd be a great shame if they start sort of CGIing people's faces to do this, because you just can't see that as looking convincing. I mean, when they've done the sort of Star Wars things where they bring in the faces of actors and actresses now dead, or they make Mark Hamill look younger and this sort of thing, or the same with the Indiana Jones last film with Harrison Ford. The reaction's never quite... It's very good, but it doesn't quite look real. I think you can't get the very subtle things that an actor can do. I don't think the CGI can... I think it's like too heavy makeup. It sort of conceals rather than allows some of those things that you perhaps don't even know, and perhaps they don't even consciously know how they're doing it, but they've just thought about it, and the way they're behaving on that day adds something that, particularly seen on a big screen, just carries a little extra weight, just makes the thing more convincing. So you have all of this. You have an Alexander who basically looks the same once he's got to his late teens. But fair enough. Again, as I say, I think Farrell does a good job. And there are moments that are... You don't see any sieges. You see the army marching. There's some nice scenes of them marching, and they talk about the Hindu Kush, when obviously they didn't know it was called that at the time. But you've got to try and explain to the audience where you are, and that's I think absolutely fine. And there are some nice scenes of the army and all the camp followers and the baggage as the army's got bigger. As Alexander acquires more people, yes, he suffers casualties, but he recruits all these allied troops and people from the conquered nations. So the army, by the time it gets to India, is really big. Instead of being the sort of 30 to 40,000, you're dealing with 100,000, 150,000, and you've acquired all these. Lots of the soldiers have taken wives; they're having children with them, even if they're already got wives back home in Macedonia, and they're moving with the column. So it's this sense of almost a city on the march, and that's nice. So there's some nice sense. There are glimpses of the distances involved, both through the maps and when you see these panoramic shots filmed in the mountains, I'm not sure where they did those, that look really good. There's probably less about travelling. One of the things that struck me most doing the Philip and Alexander book, that I've always tried to emphasise in anything biographical I've done, is looking at where the person is and what they're doing, month by month, day by day, as far as you can. And Philip was pretty much always on the move, though much more locally than Alexander. But Alexander rarely stops. There are not months and months where he spends settling down and administrating. Not really until the very end, in the last period of his life, and even then he's planning his next campaign. But once he lands in 334 BC, he keeps on moving, and there are very, very few rest periods. And the rest periods are when things can tend to go wrong, and there are problems, friction, murders, plots, this sort of thing. You don't quite get that sense of constantly on the move. It's there, I think, if you can pick it up, and I think they hint enough, but I don't know whether, if you don't know that's what's happening, you'd necessarily pick that up. Nor do you get the sense of the constant fighting. There's a little bit in some of Ptolemy's narrations. At one point he talks about in India, where we're not taking any prisoners anymore, we're massacring people that resist. You don't get the key thing about Alexander, and indeed Philip, is that they spent most of their life on campaign. And a lot of that time, they only fight a small number of big pitched battles that are inevitably more dramatic and draw the attention, but they're fighting a lot. But it's sieges, it's raids, it's surprise attacks, it's chasing people around. Now you get hints of this, particularly in the full version of where they're talking about Bactria, Sogdiana, those places, and but it's not dealt with, in part because it's a complicated story. You get sort of scenes of cavalry galloping around and dust flying up and this sort of thing, which are quite impressive. Don't give too much idea of it all. You don't see Alexander's men. Obviously something like Tyre would be incredibly expensive to do, and a 9-month siege there, or a couple of months of Gaza, and you'd need siege towers and the mole built out of the sea, and ships, and it's very expensive, CGI heavy, but also in terms of sets and things, and a big it's a big element in the story if you're going to include it at all. Just a glimpse of it would have probably been too expensive to be practical, and maybe confusing as well. You don't get the little attacks on all these strongholds in Afghanistan, in India, that were pretty brutal affairs and that cost the Macedonians casualties as well. And it's in the sieges that both Alexander and Philip take their worst wounds. But we don't see that. So there are aspects where they can't cover it, and perhaps you sometimes get the wrong impression of Alexander sort of settling down and administering this empire, which he does to an extent, but he does it on the hoof. He's always busy, he's always moving, and he's always moving on to the next campaign. And they do give this sense, they represent reasonably well the sense of the Macedonians saying, well, when are we going home? When's this over? We've beaten Darius, can we go home? Okay, we've hunted him down, he's dead, we've found the body, you're now definitely the great king, can we go home? Okay, we've gone into Bactria, into Sogdiana, in this area that's the far reach of the Persian Empire, we've won here, can we go home? And then eventually in India, where they just won't go any further. And they've changed things a bit to make the story intelligible, which again, is reasonable enough. But you'd always think, well, from the historian's point of view, you'd like more. But again, I can quite understand why there isn't space to do that. So they do emphasize that. They clearly, again, want to do the personal, Alexander, the character, the personality as much as possible, and to some extent, those around him. So you obviously have Hephaestion from the start. Now that varies. There's sort of more romance sex in the ultimate version, the longer one. In every stage, there's a bit more about Philip and Olympias as well. So perhaps we ought to start with them, I suppose, because we haven't really dealt with that. So you get the sense of the one-eyed older Philip. It's Val Kilmer, Angelina Jolie as Olympias, Alexander's mother, one of Philip's wives. Again, they sort of imply, which again a lot of older versions of Alexander would, that Philip only has one wife at a time, and then the final marriage to the niece of Attalus provokes this crisis, provokes the murder, this sort of thing. As far as we can tell, actually, it's just polygamy seems reasonably common for the Macedonian royal family. So he probably has half a dozen wives at any one time, because we're not sure how long all of them live, but about 7 or 8 in total. Olympias coming from the kingdom of Epirus, they emphasize very much, she's barbarian, she's foreign, she's not Macedonian, which is there and is in the friction in the traditions about Attalus and this sort of thing. Though again, Epirus, it's a neighbouring kingdom, it's similar in many respects. One curious thing, most of Alexander and his friends, not all, but many of them are shown as blonde-haired, and they've gone for this is in the sources, that Alexander is sort of lion-like, tawny-haired, this sort of thing. If you look at the mosaic that's down in the Museum of Naples, it doesn't look that fair. It's not sort of the bright, the very, very light blonde that you have here in the film, that you have in the old Richard Burton one. Blonde as we Westerners would see it. It's more not black or even dark brown, it's sort of mid-brown coloured hair. That might, however, be the fading in the mosaic that's copied supposedly from a painting, and anyway they might, things might change. Looking at some of the wall paintings from the Vergina tombs and this sort of thing, there seems to be quite a variety of hair colours amongst the Macedonians. Fair, quite fair to ginger to brown to black. As I say, quite a few of the men are blonde. When you get the mass scenes in the palace, for some reason, and maybe this reflected what extras were available where you filmed it, all the women are dark-haired and usually black-haired. I only noticed that watching it again recently, and it was one of those, just, sometimes you're sort of seeing things and think, there's something slightly odd about this, why doesn't this add up? Doesn't matter, doesn't make any difference, not a big deal. Just throw that out because I hadn't spotted it before. Angelina Jolie and Val Kilmer are the sort of the power couple who have come to hate each other, though again at one point you have with Olympia saying, no, I still love Philip, even though I hate him as well. You've got all the stuff about her being involved with the cult of Dionysus, snakes in a bed, handling around snakes. Angelina Jolie goes for quite a sort of a weird, disturbing, scary Olympias, which again is a viable reading of the stories about her and what she does, after Alexander's death as well, when she's a prominent political figure then, until she's killed. Philip II is always in the shadow of Alexander, his son, partly because the sources for him are so much poorer as well, but that's also a reflection. Alexander does so many spectacular things that all the books that had been written about Philip, none of them survive. And the way he turned around the Macedonian kingdom from being preyed on by all its neighbours into this united, powerful unit with a very effective army that goes around and starts to dominate not just the tribes to the north, but also southern Greece as well, and is in a position to launch this invasion of the Persian Empire. That's an incredible story. It's one I've tried to tell in the Philip and Alexander book, but it's harder to tell. There are long periods of Philip's life where we're not quite sure where he is for months on end. Alexander, you always know where he is, reasonably well anyway, and what he's doing. But again, this is about Alexander, it's not about Philip. But Philip is quite a big, to their credit, he's a big presence, and in this sort of ultimate version, even more so. He pops up in various places, and because you've got this structure where Alexander is sort of, there are flashbacks to things that have happened in the past, he figures all the way through the story. So again, they explain why they did this and they thought, well, with stars like that, but also, you need to show them, but also to emphasize the prominence that in a sense you've got an Alexander competing with his father, trying to get out from under his shadow, but also wanting his approval. So there's all sorts of emotions going on, and I think they do a pretty good job. Val Kilmer is very much the over-the-top, slightly sort of thuggish, threatening Philip, but also clearly a man who's at the peak of things, who's done so well. You get, and I'm glad this is in there, the Bucephalus story of Alexander taming this horse. That's a nice scene. I like horses, but it's a nice story. Again, whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's there in the sources. It's perfectly legitimate for them to use it, and it's quite fun. And Bucephalus will feature. Another aside that I only noticed really, I think this time watching it again. Maybe I did in the past and I had forgotten, but I'm pretty sure throughout the film Colin Farrell rides without stirrups. So does the historical thing, but they've given him quite a good sort of saddle underneath the saddlecloth of the horse. But that's impressive stuff in some of the scenes he's done, and good on them for doing it. I'm not sure about the wider. I think some of the other characters you see are also without stirrups. I suspect when you get to the extras and some of the mass scenes, for understandable safety reasons, probably they do have them. But it doesn't jar. It's not one of those things where you keep seeing them all the time. So that's, there are lots of nice little touches in the film that shows the level of care they've got, and you can see this in lots of other things, whether the story works or not in various films and series. You always have a sense of whether the people doing it really care, and they're trying their very best. And I think this is one of the ones where they clearly are. And not all the films I've covered so far, but quite a few of them, that's clearly they're trying to do that within the level of knowledge at the time and what they thought they're trying to represent. And obviously this is harder for the ancient world. And sometimes the more you get right, then the more anything that's wrong jumps out and looks glaring. But again, there are lots of things that most of the audience isn't going to notice, but I think add to that feeling that this is authentic. So you have lots more, Angelina Jolie and Val Kilmer, they play off each other. It's pretty wild stuff, and Olympias particularly, and she features writing letters to Alexander, and he imagines sort of seeing them, I can't remember if this is in the earlier versions and the theatrical version, but in the sort of final cut, when Alexander tells the army in India, right, we're going back to Macedonia, we're going home, he sort of imagines seeing Val Kilmer as Philip up on the sort of the ridge behind the soldiers, and sort of nods approvingly. I can't remember if that's there or not, and it's again, we don't know enough about any of these people really to know their personalities. That's true of Alexander, it's true of his father, it's true of his mother. We get glimpses that are heavily tainted by propaganda in various ways. So you have to go basically artistic. You've got to decide, this is how I'm going to present them. I think this is, reasonable. Again, accent-wise, Angelina Jolie seems to have a sort of slightly sort of Russian-type accent to make her different. It's slightly odd, but then, you've got all these Irish Macedonians, so why not? And Ptolemy is the only person who's allowed to be a bit Welsh because of Anthony Hopkins. So that's nice to have there. But it works in a way. And one of the Greeks, is he Greek? I can't remember. One of the soldiers is a Scot that appears a few times. One of the phalanx leaders. Again, that might only be in the longer version. I'm not sure whether his scenes were lost. You still see the man and the actor, but whether he got to say as much in the shortened version. There's much more the sort of relationship with Hephaestion, which is sort of clearly implied, at least at some stage, to have been physical love as well as great friendship and closeness and all this sort of thing. The unrated version pushes that a bit further because, again, there's more time for this. And he's clearly important, as he clearly was. But again, one of the great difficulties we have is that the sources don't really talk about him so much. Nor do they talk a great deal about Alexander's sex life compared to the amount of interest that in subsequent generations, particularly in modern scholarship, tends to be shown towards it. It just isn't a big feature of these sources. So in the theatrical version you have Hephaestion, you also have Bagoas, the eunuch, but he doesn't appear very much. In the extended, the ultimate version, whatever it's called, he's there a lot. And, you have a nude sex scene and all this sort of thing. He is mentioned a few times. Again, the coverage of him is brief, is anecdotal. He's clearly a royal favourite. Whether he was a lover or not depends how reliable those sources are. There is the quote from Plutarch that Alexander is supposed to have said that sleep, food and sex bothered him because they reminded him he was mortal. So he didn't like really doing any of them. But the implication is, of course, obviously, naturally, he had to sleep, he had to eat, and that by implication as well, he has sex. It's obviously a difficult thing. I think the uncut version sort of goes further and emphasises Alexander's sexuality and the sort of ambiguity of all of this, because you have more scenes with Roxanne in that, the first wife he marries. You don't get the mistress he's had for some considerable time, taken on from one of the Greek leaders of the Persian mercenaries fighting for Darius, with whom he'll have a child, have a son. You don't get that. But again, there's not space. They've gone for, it's a difficult country. I'm not a great fan of sex scenes in films anyway, and, just don't think it's a spectator sport. The film probably puts more emphasis on this aspect of his life than I suspect Alexander himself might have wanted. But again, whether or not that's fair, and obviously it's controversial, people in Greece particularly get upset if Alexander's represented as homosexual at all. The ancient sources suggest that both he and Philip took lovers, both male and female, but how reliable those sources are very hard to say. When somebody, it's a rumour because this person is around a lot, are they really your mistress, your lover or whatever, or are you using them politically or simply for their company? Who knows, apart from the individuals themselves. With Alexander, you have the sort of slightly weird scene where with Roxanne, it's sort of this angry erotic exchange. Very little is known about her. Again, she is, if anything, more significant after his death. It's pitched as, this is very weird. Why does he suddenly, when he hasn't married anybody at all, he suddenly picks the daughter of a relatively obscure nobleman in the wilder eastern parts of the former Persian Empire? Well, again, so much with Alexander, you're thinking, well, what's he doing and why is he doing this? They do pick up on the several times, particularly in the longer version, you've left Macedonia, you're fighting this war, but you haven't left an heir, which a lot of modern scholars single out. But again, you do have to remember that even if Alexander had a child before he left Macedonia and had married then, and it happened to be a boy, that boy would have only been in his early teens by the time Alexander died, so would probably have struggled to succeed him and keep control of all the empire in that situation. And of course there's no guarantee that you're going to have a child at all, let alone a boy, and that it's going to survive. So some of that sort of modern assumptions that we project onto Alexander in hindsight, because obviously Alexander didn't plan on dying so young, any more than Philip planned on getting murdered. They do that, particularly in the longer version, this sense of, with Philip, that Alexander could be replaced because Philip could live on for another 20 years or more. So they do, it's a reasonable job of trying to deal with the politics. But again, and the sort of sexuality and all this sort of thing, I get, maybe you like that sort of thing, you don't. I think particularly the longer version, there was too much of that for me, but that's partly a reflection, as I say, of I feel the sources are so poor that we really don't know much about him. But again, this is not a documentary. This is a film. So I suspect the theatrical version, because obviously the audience, on the whole, particularly before we've got to modern fashions, which is sort of pushing diversity everywhere, 20 years ago, people were less keen on having a significant homosexual element within the story, and now, like it or not, that's what we've got to have in films. So it's there, but it's whether it explains that much about Alexander, I don't know. But again, it depends what you're going for in the film and what you're trying to do. Theatrical version, I thought, just about got the balance right, where it was hinted at and implied, but not more than that. And Hephaestion is very close to Alexander and a supporter and a friend, but you don't sort of see more than that. And I thought they did it quite well. And the comments, well, who is this? He is Hephaestion, and this sort of thing. There are. I thought that was good, but again, Hephaestion, the sources for him are very poor, and the association of the two of them as the sort of Achilles Patroclus comes much later, after both are dead. And it's with this tradition of hero cult and all this idea, it comes within, in the same way that if you go back to the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus are not openly portrayed as lovers in a physical sense. But that becomes the interpretation that many Greeks in later generations assume. And you can read Homer that way if you want to, but it's not obvious, it's not clear, it's not unambiguous by any means, and you can read it other ways as well, where they are simply comrades that are very, very close and friends who depend on each other. So, as with so many of these things, because particularly the Alexander source material is so late, the stories are developed and people decide what elements they want to include. But Hephaestion does not feature much in the narratives or even in Plutarch's life of Alexander. He's there, but not very much. And the most spectacular expression of Alexander's feelings for him is when Hephaestion dies. And I seem to remember a documentary where Oliver Stone talked about this huge funeral pyre that was made for him, saying, I would have loved to have had that in the film, but he simply can't afford it. Alexander has this spectacular, over-the-top period of mourning when his friend drinks himself to death. And that suggests, but it's also, this is the period by which time, depending on how, again, you read the sources, Alexander is losing touch with reality a little bit, getting less restrained in every respect, drinking more, all of these sorts of things. That so much depends on your understanding of Alexander and what you think he was like and how you interpret him at different stages of his life. So this presents Oliver Stone's version of his interpretation of that in the physical, which is fine and reasonable and perfectly valid, and in many cases it draws on where we've got the source, and then says, well, I'm taking it this way, that's how I'm going to interpret that. Perfectly reasonable and right to do. So I would say it makes it, because he's taken quite a complex interpretation and he's allowed room for other ways of seeing Alexander, it makes the film a more demanding watch. You do have to concentrate to try and think about what he's trying to do, which again is not necessarily blockbuster country, where things are simple and you have heroes and villains, and the heroes might be a bit flawed, they might have weaknesses, but basically they're going to win, or they do well enough, and then that flaw will perhaps lead to their demise at the end, or this is a much more complex film than that, and the way the narrative is presented is far more complicated than that. And as a result, it comes back to this: the more times you see it. I mean, I've probably seen it 4 or 5 times now, which for me is relatively few for a film I like. But it's one of those films I don't think you can watch too often. But it improves each time, although there are still things I think, oh, I wish they hadn't done it that way, but that's often a perfectly valid. What they've done is reasonable. You can interpret the sources that way. It's just my particular slant. I've maybe got a bit too close to the Alexander story. And you write a biography of anybody, you tend to develop your own sense of how you think they were. That is fine as long as you remember it's just your own sense. Yes, you've based it on all the evidence, but that is not the only way of interpreting things. And with Alexander, I would say of all the biographies I've written, he is the hardest person to pin down. Even with Philip, you get more of a sense with the poorer sources of the sort of man he was. Alexander defies easy definition. And that's one of the problems, that I think Oliver Stone is invested enough in the story and the history to face that problem, that he is so hard to pin down, that he's introduced that into the film, which makes the film more complicated and therefore, as I say, less likely to please an audience that hasn't spent that time thinking about it, doesn't know the background. So I think there's reasons why this isn't the sort of, top of everybody's list of favourite films, why it's not sort of thing you watch repeatedly and did spectacularly well at the box office, because obviously it's a costly thing to produce. This is an epic in itself just to get the thing made. But on the other hand, it's a very worthy film. It tries a lot of interesting things, and some work and some don't. But nevertheless, that's the nature of the story. Alexander is so hard to pin down, and his story, so what he did in such a short time is so spectacular that it's very hard to compact it into a story. So those are my general feelings about the film, but I've saved till the last the battle scenes, which are obviously a big interest in these videos. And even though this video is going on much longer than I'd planned, sorry about that, but I'll see. I think we'll probably keep this as one. Now I want to look at the 2 major battle scenes. You've got Gaugamela and Hephaestus. Now again, where they fall in the film depends on the cut. Gaugamela is fairly early on, and in the documentary things described sort of end of the first of 5 acts. In the theatrical version, you sort of start with the death, you go back to Ptolemy, you then move to just before Gaugamela, then you have flashbacks to childhood, growing up, Philip, this sort of thing. Before I get on to the battles, there's one last thing that I mentioned. In the Alexander Revisited, the final cut version, you get hints in the wedding feast for Philip, with the argument, this is the man who's going to conquer Persia, but he can't get from one couch to another, where Alexander flees the country. briefly, you actually get Pausanias, the murderer of Philip, appears and is named, and you see him being mistreated and sodomized by Attalus, and then being dragged away protesting. So you get the story that Aristotle was one of the sources for, that a former lover of Philip is humiliated by Attalus, gang raped by his servants, and that he feels when he goes to Philip makes him a royal bodyguard, which is a great honour. There's only 7 of them, but he doesn't do anything to Attalus, who's now his father-in-law, and that is why Pausanias, feeling that Philip has let him down, murders Philip. And Aristotle explains this as this is a murder that's a crime of passion, for the murderer's point of view. You get much more of that is shown. Now, partly, it's a very dark story, and bear in mind this film's all out before Game of Thrones stuff, which made a lot more things acceptable in TV drama and film to some extent, and the sort of idea you can make a blockbuster and a very successful series, but it's got a very high rating because it's pretty violent, pretty gruesome, pretty nasty, pretty sexual. So that's there, which I don't think is in the theatrical version. Again, it's one of those details. It's a pretty grim detail, but it's there, and you see Pausanias, and he's recognised as murdering Philip much more clearly than getting shot down than I think you did earlier on. So they obviously, there was a lot more levels of detail in the story before they cut. Anyway, back to the battles. We'll spend most time on Gaugamela because this is it's probably got a good claim to being the best depiction of an ancient battle on screen in a mainstream film. There are documentary dramas that try to follow the sort of narrative a little more closely, but they don't have the budget of this, and they're doing something different. It's quite a long scene. It's it lasts a while, and again, in these relatively early days of CGI, it's presented remarkably well. There are big simplifications, inevitably, but you get a depiction of numbers. You have this sense, they present this sort of eagle, the eagle of Zeus is flying over, and you get the bird's view is to explain the sort of aerial shots and things, and it works. So you get some nice depictions of the Macedonian army forming up. You get a sacrifice before battle that's rather nice, in terms of, again, a little detail that's not really explained. You're presenting these things, and I always like the series that do that, that put the things in there, and if you think, oh yeah, that's there, and as long as they're not too obtrusive, if you don't know, it doesn't really matter. But you might have added, oh yeah, that's interesting what they're doing. It makes it more exotic, a bit more different. You have aerial shots of the massed armies deploying. The Persians look a bit of a shambles. They're much more crowd-like, probably unfairly. They've got cavalry, they've got camels, they've got chariots, they've got lots of infantry. Costume thing is not too bad. There's a lot we don't know about different contingents of the Persian army. They've gone for that sense of this is an empire come together, lots of different contingents, and again, they know, well, they probably would have been even more exotic than this. Looks as if the front line was all cavalry at Gaugamela beyond the heavy chariot area, which they haven't gone for. But again, fair enough. That there are different ways of interpreting this, and my version of the Battle of Gaugamela is probably different from other people's. You have the pre-battle planning and argument. They use one of those conventions that it crops up quite a lot of, sort of a map, but with little sort of statuettes, little models, blocks for where the units are and the leaders are, and so Alexander can say, and then we'll be going through here. It's useful, it's done. It's the main place where you have the various stories, particularly about Parmenion, as he's in the film, presenting the sort of the cautious view to Alexander. Oh, don't cross the Granicus, wait until tomorrow. I'd be ashamed if a stream like this blocks me after I've crossed the Mediterranean Sea. Attack, we win. And here, interestingly enough, I think it's given to Cassander, where why don't we attack at night? And he said, no, Alexander says, I'm not going to steal a victory. And the Parmenio does have the one, which again is slightly earlier, where Darius offers Alexander the sort of western half of his empire, royal marriage, all this sort of thing, for peace. And Parmenion says, look, it's more than we ever dreamed of getting, let's accept that. And Alexander comes out that I would accept it if I was Parmenion. So all of that tradition is there. It's all compacted. There's an element where both of these battles include lots of incidents from out beyond, from other bits often beforehand. Hydaspes in particular is very stylized, consciously so, doesn't bear much relation to the real battle, but isn't really meant to. It's sort of it's a rounding things off. These are really the only two periods of fighting you get in the entire film. So that does perhaps give less of a sense of Alexander constantly at war, but again, I can understand budget-wise. Now, I think the Gaugamela scenes were filmed in Morocco, and they're on a very dusty plain, which, again, they comment in the documentaries, like how much dust was thrown up by all the extras, and particularly by the horses' hooves. The horses are all shod because obviously this is modern. These are modern horses, so you can't get lots of unshod ones around. Again, I happened to notice that, which I hadn't before, so I thought I'd throw in that useless little bit of information. It's interesting. Major General Fuller, one of the pioneers of the Armoured Corps in the British Army in the First World War, and subsequently wrote books about Alexander and Caesar. And in his book on Alexander, he talks about being on horseback on the Maidan, one of the exercise grounds of fields outside cantonments, the bases in India, and how quickly, with large numbers of horses there, your visibility went almost to nil. The amount of dust that is thrown up on a summer's day. And that's reflected very much, and I think it was also reflected genuinely when they were doing the filming. But then Oliver Stone talks about how useful this was because it could give you that sense of confusion of a battle. It could sometimes conceal the numbers. It's very well done, that sort of swirling sense, and it gives a sense of activity, motion, and trying to bring order to chaos, which Alexander is trying to do by focusing on our objective is to get Darius. So that's quite well done. You have early on, there's again, words like nice and things like this perhaps in the context seem wrong, but I can't think of anything better. Depictions of the Macedonian phalanx. You have these blocks of pikemen. The kit's pretty good. Dale Dye was the military advisor on the film and heavily involved in this, and his sort of stuff, whatever the period, does tend to, the military scenes look just that bit better. Everybody's always dealing with a load of extras. You certainly can't get Macedonian soldiers or people trained to use pikes. So within a relatively short time, all the advisors, the assistants, people have got to drill these people, make methods by which they can do the maneuvers that work both practically in terms of getting them around to the right place during the scene, but also that they remember, and also to do the things required by the story and to make it look good visually. And they do a very good job in this. A lot had to be invented because details of pike drill we don't have. We've got a lot of stuff about formations and things. But there's some nice bits of manoeuvring. You have drummers involved, which tend to crop up in lots of on-screen ancient armies and ancient battles. There's very little evidence for their use by Greek armies or Roman armies. It may be because we forget about how noisy the metallic armour, shields, equipment would be, so that actually a drum simply wouldn't carry over that, the sort of rattling and thudding, or that they just don't think of this, they think of drums as a different context. Trumpets, which you do see once or twice, yes, that's a big deal, and flutes and things like that, but not drummers, not keeping step in that way. And there are all sorts of arguments about whether or not ancient armies marched in step. I suspect they did because it's just easier, and you could even see, okay, there are a load of models, but in some of the models from the Egyptian tombs from much earlier, soldiers all seen, they're all marching on they're all in the same step. Now, whether that's just you've copied one figure, but who knows? Talks about cadence marching and marching in step and all this sort of thing. That's something for another day. It's very nicely done. You see the lineup, you see Alexander giving his pep talk, recognizing individual soldiers, praising them, all this sort of thing. Again, they stylize it because obviously he couldn't talk to the whole army in one go, but he's seen moving around. It's quite well done. The Persians, by contrast, they're sort of silent, they're waiting, they're serried ranks. Darius is there in his scythe chariot, looking very impressive, but he doesn't do very much. The tactics are simplified in that you have, the idea is Parmenio will, and he's put Philotas over there, his son, again for convenience of the story rather than this is consciously, no, okay, he wasn't there, but he was with Alexander on the other flank, but it works for the story to put in there. There on the left, the idea is the left has to hold out as long as possible, even if they're outflanked, cope, while Alexander wins the battle on the right. And the centre, which is mostly the pikemen, just pins the Persians in place. It's simplified very much of any interpretation. It's sort of slightly, bit of Issus, bit of Gaugamela, but also it's simplified because it has to be. You can't explain something as complex as this within the running time. And Alexander then starts riding off to the right to create a gap in the Persian line, to spread the Persians thin. They'll try and match him because they don't want to be outflanked. And you see this sort of race, which is partly what went on. There was an inclination. The whole army advances and inclines towards the right anyway, moving away from the area that Darius had cleared so that his scythe chariots could go through and break up the Macedonian infantry formation. The Persian plan is reasonably logical. They've responded to the things that have gone wrong in the past. And at Gaugamela, they're trying to get it right, but Alexander outthinks them. You see that inevitably this is on screen. Everybody when they're on horseback canters or gallops around everywhere. They don't save the horse's energy for later. So, but again, it looks good. Alexander steams off. The Persians sort of try and match him. They're going parallel. Loads of dust. Helps to blur the numbers a bit, but they've got some nice depictions of wedge-shaped companion cavalry and sort of wedge-shaped formation of companion cavalry. I talk about this a little bit in the book, in that I suspect we've always got it wrong to think of one whole squadron of 200, 300 men being in one big wedge, and probably some troop-size units. You're broken up into several of them to make more use of the manoeuvrability. But again, that's one little hobby horse of mine. So Alexander goes that way. He spreads the Persians out. You have the scythe chariot attack, which is quite nicely done. I mean, they're better supported in the film they probably were in reality, and lots of cavalry and others come after them. You have this volley of bow fire, lots of arrows being shot up. Again, classic Hollywood, high, arcing up in the air to drop down. Not always the best way of doing this, but the effect is pretty devastating, and loads of pikemen are shot down. Probably too effective. None of the arrows clatter against the spear shafts, as we're told they did, or strike shields. But again, it's good dramatic stuff. It's setting the battle up. And one nice thing in this is that the Persians are not presented as a walkover. These are tough opponents who fight really hard. Darius's nerve breaks, but this is still a really hard battle. You then have the scythe chariots come towards the phalanx. I think the order sort of prepare to receive chariots or something. But anyway, they do what they did. They open up lanes between the blocks, and the horses are in the main drawn towards those lanes and steam down them where they're taken out mainly by light infantry. This happens, it's more condensed in the film. It all sort of happens in between the blocks of pikemen rather than much further back. You don't see in the film that Alexander's army is in two lines in this battle, almost in a big hollow square, at least the centre part of it. Again, I can understand why it's just a bit too complicated. So that's quite nicely done. Inevitably, some of the scythe chariots do scythe through people's legs. We don't know whether any of them succeeded in doing that in the film, whether they all just went between the thing. But again, not unreasonable, dramatic, gruesome, to show how horrific these battles are. At least one of them sort of slams in and pitches up. But it's pretty good. Again, by Hollywood standards, this is pretty close to what we think happened and what the sources tell us happened. You then have a mass charge by the Persian army and lots of infantry. The pikemen go towards them and they come in. Now there's some good scenes of the blocks of pikemen and the sarissai impaling Persians, this sort of thing. It then breaks down a little bit. You still have, which is nice, blocks of Macedonians throughout the sort of narrative of the battle, the film, with their sarissai. They get a bit ragged. Again, that's fair enough. We're told the phalanx did break up when it advanced to any period. You also get the individuals fighting and smashing. This is done in quite a sort of brutal, savage way. And clearly, phalangites do get killed. So there's something going on that isn't simply that the enemy is facing all these rows of spears and can't get to you. There are gaps, there are bits of confused fighting, and you have other troops as well within the Macedonian army who are not pikemen. So it goes a little bit towards the Hollywood stylized, lots of individual duels and everybody opening out, but does always keep the formations, so it's a nicer touch than many, that there is a sense of more order to it, but that this is chaotic, this is brutal. You have Parmenio and Philotas are over on the left. They're facing ever-growing odds. Interestingly enough, they're all depicted as having infantrymen. You don't have the Thessalian cavalrymen that Parmenio commanded in successive battles. Again, I can understand it would be an extra confusion to explain who these people were, and also it means that we know, they do say captured left flank, and you see Parmenio and Philotas, so you know who they are, where you are. If you've had horsemen there as well in any significant numbers, you might have thought, well, are we over with Alexander? So again, I can understand it's a reasonable simplification for the sake of making the battle intelligible to the audience. So back to Alexander on the right flank, and you'll sort of flick between the two. It's nicely done. You get some good aerial shots of this impression of these massed armies fighting, and of the groups. The Macedonians always look a bit more ordered, but nevertheless the order is getting more and more shaky as the battle goes on. Alexander goes to the right, then after a while he sends somebody else, I can't remember if it's Cassandra or someone else, goes right to keep the Persians. Darius has sent Bessus to deal with this. They draw the Persians off, and then Alexander and his group of companions veer back to the left and head towards the centre, where the Persian army's got a lot more ragged and opened up, and they head towards Darius. And you have clashes, the charges, encounters, battle. With the cavalry fighting, again, you've got this, they are interpenetrating. Well, that's what cavalry units tend to do, far more than infantry. Again, the dust helps. It looks very impressive. Alexander gets wounded in the thigh, which I think happened at Issus, but again, okay, fair enough. He does take wounds in a lot of his battles. He also then is thrown from his horse, and he's down. He's been fighting. He's lost his spear, and a Persian is about to cut him down when Black Clitus appears and chops off the Persian's arm. So again, that's from Battle of Granicus, but it's a reasonable enough incident to move. They've sort of condensed the battles into one, really. And then Alexander is fighting on foot for a few moments with just a couple of companions of his sort of, people around him that are saving him and keeping him alive. There is the emphasis, Alexander is taking lots of risks, but is fighting very hard and is good at fighting, but he's not a Superman, swords don't just bounce off him. You see, amongst this fighting, there's one interesting bit where a Persian strikes a Macedonian on the back on the cuirass, but the Macedonian isn't badly injured and is able to kill the Persian. Generally speaking, their armour seems to have protected them very well, and a theme I noticed in the sources doing the book is the very high proportion of wounded to killed, even more than you'd normally expect in these Macedonian battles and sieges. So the armour seems to have worked pretty well against the weapons that were used being employed by the opponents. Alexander then remounts on Bucephalus, steams towards Darius. Darius panics, turns around his chariot, retreats out, scythes on the wheels, so he's scything down his own men as he goes. Alexander's about to pursue him to sort of complete the victory when Philotas comes over to say, look, the left wing's lost unless you help us. And he's drawn, he's frustrated. Again, it's based on the sources. He goes back. It's implied there's lots more heavy fighting as there was in reality, but the Persians are beaten. And then you go to the aftermath of the battle, and you go to the hospital, and the dealing with all these gruesome wounds. And it's interestingly done. Again, emphasis in the sources, particularly Arrian, of Alexander visiting the wounded after an engagement and making sure they're dealt with before he is. Again, it's a Roman stereotype. Now, whether it's become a Roman stereotype because of Alexander, or whether the Romans have imposed it back on Alexander, I don't know. But it works well to give that sense that they're only able to glimpse time and again. Remember, all that you have, the companion, the hetairoi, the cavalry, but all the Macedonians are companions of the king. That sense that you're all still part of the same community or an army fighting together for the common cause, they bring out quite well. So this is, it's a well done battle. As I say, I think it's probably the best I've seen so far in a mainstream film of any ancient battle. It's got a mix. There are bits that are Hollywood licensed, and the unrated version is I think more brutal. Even the theatrical one was pretty gruesome, but there's even more. But it does give a sense of scale. It does give a sense of Alexander's sort of what he's doing tactically, the brutality of the fighting, the toughness of the fighting, Alexander's personal example, and the fact that he's in the middle of all this swirling dust, fighting, staying alive. He's not giving orders all the time. You know, he's not the battlefield manager. He sets things up and then he steams in, and he's the point of the spear. So you know, it is very good stuff. So I think that's one that scores very highly, and so far is certainly the most convincing ancient battle we've talked about in any of these episodes. Hydaspes, the battle in India, was filmed in Thailand. They created a sort of artificial forest jungle area, even though of course it's not really. They admit in the commentaries and documentaries it's not really based on the real battle of Hydaspes. They have the elephants there, which they wanted to show, and you know, it's pretty impressive that this line of war elephants coming. They have howdahs, they have head armor on the head and this sort of thing, which you could argue probably the Indian ones of that time wouldn't have had. But nevertheless, for the practical point of view, you know, and you look and you're thinking, this actually looks pretty dangerous. This had to be a very well choreographed scene, but it is in the same way that Gaugamela has elements for other battles. This one even more is sort of showing the strain on Alexander's army, but how he's still willing to fight, to risk his own body to lead them, but how determined he is to defeat the enemy. They're coming up against elephants that are something, you know, there were a few at Gaugamela, but this is en masse. They don't know how to deal with. It's new, it's scary, and because there are those medallions commemorating this. Porus, the Indian king, doesn't really. I mean, he's there on top of his elephant, but he doesn't really get to do much. You don't. Interestingly enough, the story about him is that after the battle, when Alexander defeated him and he's brought before him, Alexander says, "How would you like to be treated?" And Porus says, "Like a king." That line's given to Statira, Darius's daughter, when they meet in Babylon, like a queen or like a princess. I can't remember what the term is, which is not quite what she's supposed to have said then, but in each case Alexander grants them very royal treatment. Porus, you know, is described as sort of well over 6 foot tall, massive, charismatic. He does have, you feel this sort of Bollywood extravaganza is waiting to be made about him if they haven't already. But he's a great adversary in the sources for Alexander. But this battle has a lot more to do with the storming of the Malian town afterwards, after the army is mutinied, after they've gone, they're starting on their way back, where Alexander and his men are assaulting the walls of a town. The men seem to be hanging back some ladders, are struggling. Alexander seems to be losing his patience by this point, decides that they're wavering, climbs up a ladder with just 3 men. The ladder breaks behind them so nobody can follow, and then just with, you know, he and 3 others are in the middle of this enemy-held town, jumps down and tries to fight them off, gets shot with an arrow through the chest and badly wounded, but is protected, and the rest of them manage to get in and save him. That's the sort of theme of this. So Bucephalus died, and you get the city of named after him in India around about this time, probably not in battle. Here he's killed, an arrow that goes through and then wounds Alexander, and you know, again, and you have, it does have echoes of the medallions that are issued after Hydaspes. That quite remarkable scene where the elephant rears up and Alexander on Bucephalus rears up, and then the Bucephalus almost seems to keep on climbing as the elephant's coming down. It's done in slow motion and genuinely done. Apparently wasn't CGI. It is it's a very powerful image of sort of Alexander, this man on a horse confronted by this much bigger elephant, yet he's still going for it, he's still attacking, he's still leading his men. But here he's wounded. You then have, apparently it was infrared or something, the sort of screen goes largely red when he's wounded. The army fights on to save him, and they do, and they win the battle. This is all very stylized and was deliberately so. It's still got aspects of the other, you know, you sometimes have sort of Macedonian centre, this sort of thing, you've got the companions galloping around. But it's not really meant to be a representation of anything in particular. It's bringing together elements. So it's an interesting battle. It's interesting to see, you know, an Indian army of that period. It's not represented too badly, as I say. There are aspects. There are always details you could look at and say, well, probably not. But you know, again, by movie standards, they made a real effort. These are not bad at all. But it is a stylized, rather confusing battle, and it will lead to the sort of sense of Alexander, you know, this is coming to the end. We've got to go back, and that he's not so well. So you will have, again, linked together very much through Ptolemy's narration of what's happening and followed. You have the Gedrossian desert, people dying there. when they're on their way home. You have the the mutinies in the army, all this sort of thing. Again, the slight sequence. You've also had, just before this, you've had the Pages conspiracy. You've had the execution of Philotas. They tie him to a stake and throw a javelin at him, which seems to have been the way things were done. You've had the murder of Parmenio, because you can't leave. You've killed the man's son. You can't leave it, or the last remaining son. You can't leave the father around with a big command. These things are done quite quickly because, again, there's so much story to deal with. You have as well the murder of Clytus, the man who saved his life, brother of his nurse, all this sort of thing. That's all coming in. It's a bit of a rush, and again, you feel it's well done, but because they're trying to pack they're trying to get a lot in. Even though they've already decided, well, there's plenty we can't do, but they're still trying to cram a lot in. And I think the number of different versions, obviously that partly reflects studio attitudes and this sort of thing, but I think there's an element where the nature of the story, the nature of what you're trying to tell is so hard to pin down 100% that you're always thinking, well, actually, if I'm shifted a bit that way, that might work better. So coming to the end, it's the same thing. This is a really interesting film. It's got some great scenes in it. Some others, maybe they don't work so well. You can't fault it for ambition. You can't fault it for the seriousness with which they go about it. As a result, it's not a simple film, and the several versions rather suggest that no one's quite 100% happy with what came out at the end. But that's, I think, I've never been 100% happy with any of the books I've written. I always think I can make them better, and I think a lot of people in the far more challenging world of making films and TV, they always think, yeah, maybe I could just done a bit more. Maybe that would have worked if I'd done it that way. Maybe that did work, that didn't. All of these things have to deal with the reality of a schedule for shooting, of budget, of availability, of the decisions you make that you can't then undo. So it's complicated. It doesn't quite achieve all that it wanted to do, but you could say the same about Alexander the Great. He's always more ambitious for more, and there's almost that mood within the film where you feel they're trying so hard to do this and do that it's maybe if they'd been less ambitious, you would have ended up with a simpler film, easier to watch. But whether it would have been as interesting is hard to say, because we'll never know. So it's an interesting one, and it's our first look at something Greek. We might soon turn to HBO Rome. I'll see how it goes. I'm not quite decided, but maybe I'll start on those for one of the next one. Though we might, rather than just do episode after episode of that, we might put in one or two other films and the like. In the meantime, I want to do For the Roman Empire. I thought something might be interesting on the naval battle scenes from Ben-Hur. We'll look. There's quite a few others out there. As I say, we'll do a Hadrian's Wall on screen at some point. So there's various other bits. I think we'll do the 300 Spartans in a month or two as well. I quite fancy that. I'm going to be, well, when it gets to the time when in my book I'm writing on Thermopylae, I'll probably do that soon afterwards. Probably afterwards. It's always better to look at any of these artistic versions of something you're doing after you've written your version, which you want to base entirely on the evidence and not take impressions from elsewhere. But there we are, Oliver Stone's Alexander. An interesting film, as I say, one that keeps growing on me. Each time I see it, I think, yeah, there's actually more I like about that than I don't like. But it isn't one that I go and watch, every year or so. It tends to be longer intervals in between. But it's got the Gaugamela scene. As I say, I think is probably the best ancient battle put onto screen, at least so far. Let's see what they do with Hannibal and things like that. And certainly it's in a mass market film. That's the most interesting version and the most combining spectacle with some coherence and sense of what this may have been like. So full marks for that, at least, even if some aspects of the film sort of are a bit strange or don't quite work or are quite hard to follow. Even watching it now several times, I don't always pick out who everybody is every time. You have to be reminded who some of the sort of lesser Macedonian characters are. But there we go. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.